Hey everyone, so welcome today to today's class in international politics. We're going to be looking at public opinion today. So before we start, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping related to the term paper and the midterm exam that's coming up. So for the term paper, this is something that you should start thinking about. We've seen enough international politics where you can start thinking about it. And we also will be having the outline due after March break. So definitely something that you'll want to start working on. So for the term paper, you need to select a case from the 20th or 21st century. Cases could be wars, crises, trade agreements, international negotiations, changes in life, really any event that's happened in the 20th or 21st century that fits within international politics, within the definition of international politics, would be acceptable. The case must be related to a topic covered in the class. That's not really a limitation. The course is pretty much a general survey. So you'd be hard pressed to find an IR topic that we haven't discussed in the class. Cases cannot involve World War I and the Cuban Missile Crisis, largely just because there's too much written on them already that it could be hard to find kind of your own independent voice. I can't handle more of them. And any event involving both Israel and other Middle Eastern states engaging with each other. The reason here is that students typically are quite passionate on this topic if they choose to write about it. And as a result, the papers typically suffer. They're often more editorialized rather than research papers. So students typically end up doing worse on this topic. So I just, for the most part, ban the topic unless the student has a compelling reason why they need to do it and would be able to do it. It's just better to have people choose a different case. For your case, figure out something that is puzzling. This will form the basis of your research question. What part of the case still needs explaining? And when we say still needs explaining, it doesn't mean you're going to be necessarily the first person who asks this question, right? And the question could be anything really related to your case that could involve explanation, right? So if it's a war, it could be, why did this war break out? Or why did this war break out at this particular time? If it's a crisis, why or how or why did it not escalate to war? If it's a trade negotiation, why was an agreement able to be reached? Or why did the agreement take this particular form? Again, going back to war, it could involve why did this ally choose not to join the war? So say, in Iraq 2003, why did Canada stay out? Why did when losing war, so say you have a country who's involved in a war and they're losing it, why do they continue fighting a losing war? So there's all kinds of different questions that you could ask, but it's something that we would want to have explained. It's something that we'd want to understand about your particular case. And this is really what your paper is about. Your paper is not about your case per se, because there's hundreds of papers that can be written on any case. Your paper is about answering this question. So this is the most important decision, even more than the case itself, the topic itself. The most important part is the choice of a suitable question. And so always think it's, when you're choosing your question, it's something that we're explaining. So not all of your questions have to start with the word why, but they all should be able to be formulated in that type of way. Like you should be able to have an alternate formulation, right? So if your question's just kind of a what happened question, well, that's a history paper. That's not really an explanatory political science paper. So if it's a what happened, a when did this happen, that's not really what I'm talking about. How did this happen could work as long as it's less about kind of describing the process and more about explaining, how this was able to happen. Like, so why did it happen, essentially? So just always be careful. One of the biggest places where students suffer kind of on the outline is that the paper that they're proposing isn't really explaining anything. It's merely a descriptive paper. The goal of the paper is to propose and test a theory that would answer your chosen research question. You're to explain the unexplained. And don't panic about the unexplained part. This doesn't mean that you have to be unique in the first person to ask your question or propose your answer. That's almost impossible with most of these papers that you'll be doing here. So the question just really is, the idea though, behind these type of papers is that we want to be able to understand or explain something that we haven't previously been able to explain. So to help along the process and to make sure that you're on the right track, there's a term paper outline that's due on March 8th. So it's a one paper document, double-spaced, so it's not particularly long. And within this one paper document, you should include a brief description of your case. So just a little bit of background information on the chosen case that you have. Your research question. So what is it that you're going to be seeking to explain in your paper? At least 5 academic sources, citations using Chicago author date system, and there's resources on Leia for using that, that system. So at least 5 academic sources, so either books or journal articles that are related to your case that will be able to help you building your paper. And if you've got a theory that you think answers your question, so if there's a social science theory or one of the theories that you've seen in the course that you're looking at and you think, hey, I think this will prove to be a good answer to my question, you can include it. But at this stage, I'm not expecting you to have chosen your theory. Really, if you can have identified a strong case and have a good research question with some sources that you can build on, if you can have all of that in your outline by March 8th, I think you're on a really good track to have a good paper. If you've already got an answer in mind, great, but you won't be marked down in any way. Your grade won't be impacted at all if you don't. The term paper itself is due April 29th. It'll be 6 to 8 pages, double spaced, 12-point Times New Roman font. Paper should include an introduction where you'll discuss your case and research question, introduce your thesis. So kind of, what is the problem? Think of the introduction as defining what is the problem, what is the question that you're going to be asked related to the problem, and what in kind of one sentence is the answer that you're proposing. A literature review. So you're not the first person who's going to ever have written about either your case or about your type of research question. So what does the IR literature say on your chosen topic? Theory. So here's where you develop your argument and propose hypotheses. So what is your theory? So in general, what does your theory say about how the world operates? And then if your theory is correct, what would you expect to see in your case? So kind of lay out your theory in abstract terms first. What are the assumptions that it makes? How does it in general operate? And then propose kind of hypotheses about what you would expect to see if your theory is right in this case. Link your theory to your particular case. Then, once you've got a theory and proposed what you would expect to see if your theory is right, then you go out into the evidence. So go out into newspaper articles or books or government documents and see, do the facts fit your theory? And then a very, very brief conclusion. The test number 1 is coming up on next week. It'll cover readings and lectures up to and including the class on February 16th. So anything that we've covered from the first day of the term up until February 16th will be eligible to have questions on the midterm. The midterm will be a combination of multiple choice questions and true/false questions. And at the start of class on the test day, a link will be posted on Leia for you to complete the midterm on a on a website. It will be open book. There's no way that I can really control whether you use your notes or not. But as a caution, the test will include enough questions that you will not have the time to look up all of the answers. You may have time to look up some of the answers if there's some questions that you're really unsure about, but if you haven't studied and are just relying on looking up in the notes and in the book, looking up the answers, you'll run out of time quite quickly. So you can use it as a reserve. If you studied well and there's just a couple questions you forget, then you can use your notes as really good tools to help with those few questions. But if your general strategy is using them for the entire test, it would end up being a poor strategy. All right, so we've been talking a little bit about some kind of the psychological influences in international politics. We looked a little bit at it when we were talking about foreign policy. Now, much of the early work in political psychology examined deviations from rationality. So we looked at kind of biases that people had in decision making, so errors that people were making. So you have this rational choice baseline of we expect people to, weigh cost benefits, do complete information searches, have consistent preferences, but in actual behavior, we see that there's many departures from this rational baseline, this normative kind of ideal of rationality. And so a lot of the earlier work in political psychology was about kind of detailing these places where rational choice doesn't predict behavior. Now, political psychology, though, is not just the study of error. So that's what a lot of the research has been, but there's a growing areas of research that are looking at different areas too, including public opinion, emotions, individual differences in behavior, elite behavior, and neuroscientific and evolutionary theories of IR. So even including kind of neuroscience, so the functioning of the brain and evolution to produce theories of kind of IR. So we're going to talk a little bit today about public opinion and a little bit on individual difference in behavior. So public opinion matters in IR. There's been a long-running question, it's still not entirely resolved, about how important, how much impact does public opinion have? Obviously, the regime type will matter, right? The type of government will matter for how much public opinion matters. If you're in an authoritarian regime, so a non-democracy, where you don't get the vote and the government doesn't listen to the public, it doesn't need the public's approval for survival, then public opinion is not likely to play much of a role at all. All they have to do is forestall a revolution, and other than that, as long as public opinion hasn't become so toxic that there's talk of revolution, then public opinion won't matter terribly. In a democracy, public opinion can affect a leader's approval rating, which is something that's important for their chance of re-election. It can actually directly even affect voting. And so it can affect policy decisions. And this can be multiple ways that can affect policy decisions. So first, it could be that the government makes a decision and the public voices its discontent through kind of threats of voting or polls for voting, or in terms of changing approval ratings, and so the government changes its decision. It can also affect decisions before the public's even reacted. So if there's a government that knows it has an election coming up, or that's relatively sensitive to changes in approval rating because it's already unpopular enough, it may anticipate what it believes public opinion to be when it's formulating the decision that it's making. And so, for example, if it's looking at a list of 5 options, but 2 of the options it knows it's going to lead to public opinion backlash, then it may avoid those 2 options. So it's not that the public ever reacted, but the government anticipates a particular public opinion reaction, and so it makes the choices accordingly. So if public opinion matters, then the question becomes, how does the public make decisions? How informed is the public on foreign policy? Because ideally then, if they're influential in the process, we would like the public opinion to be bringing sound opinions to the kind of the foreign policy making process. Now, political knowledge in general about all range of politics is quite low among the public. But this is particularly true about foreign policy. And this misinformation can have an important impact on public opinion, right? So if you're forming your opinion on the basis of incorrect information, incorrect understanding of the situation, then this can lead you to have misinformed or policy preferences. And if these misinformed policy preferences influence ultimate government decision, can lead to choices of bad policy or suboptimal policy. So here's one example of kind of how low levels of information can lead to problematic policy decisions, or at least policy preferences. So this was a poll that was done in 2015 during kind of the primary setting for the in the lead up to the 2016 presidential elections, or the Democratic primaries and the Republican primaries. So at a recent poll of primary voters in the US, 30% of Republicans and 19% of Democrats supported the bombing of Agrabah, and only 13% of Republicans and 36% of Democrats opposed it. Now, 30% of Republicans, so they're almost 1/3 of Republicans and 20% of Democrats supported the bombing of Agrabah. So what did Agrabah do to the US? What were the crimes that were leading people to support bombing of it? Well, think for a minute about where Agrabah is located. I don't know how much you know about that particular region, but clearly there were events in that region that were bad enough that 1 in 3 about Republicans and about 1 in 5 Democrats supported bombing it. And only 13% of Republicans and so only just more than 1 in 10 Republicans and a little bit more than 1/3 of Democrats opposed it. Now, in both cases for Republicans and Democrats, large, at least pluralities of respondents said that they didn't know. And that may be the appropriate response. But we'll show, so if you've been trying to think about where Agrabah is located, I'm going to help you out a little bit to see how kind of nonsensical that 30% of Republicans and 20% of Democrats were. Agrabah is the fictional kingdom in the film Aladdin. So this clearly, when making their decision, they weren't basing it on sound historical knowledge, unless they actually want to be bombing Disney, which I would feel is probably quite unlikely. They were basing their decision not based on facts of events happening in Agrabah, because of, you know, it's fictional, but based on something else. Now, it may be a foreign policy orientation where they always support war. It may be an inference based on the sounding of the name, an inference about the location based on kind of how the name sounds. So placing it perhaps in the Middle East. And then if they're getting a question about bombing the Middle East, an assumption made by the respondent that then it's within a hostile government, or it is a hostile country. So there could be inferences that are being made based on the fact that the question is being asked. That's possible. But clearly, there are people who were making decisions about whether they support bombing of a country on the basis of very little understanding of the situation to no understanding of the situation. This here is in the context, so this was a survey done in 2014, around the time of the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict over Crimea. And so survey respondents were given this map and they were asked to identify the Ukraine, and then they're asked a series of questions about foreign policy preferences. So each dot is it's a respondent's kind of click for where they selected the Ukraine to be located. So hang on, I just want to turn on annotation to you. So, you know, many of the responses aren't terrible, right? So any of the responses that are kind of in the Eastern European context up against the border with Russia. So anything kind of along this band, and to be honest, even out into here isn't terrible. Even if they're not pointing exactly to the Ukraine, it's still showing, you know, I don't expect that everybody could point to every country within Europe or every country, hopefully every country within North America they can, but every country within Europe or Asia or Africa or South America even, I don't expect everybody to be able to point to every single one of them. That's an unrealistic assumption about foreign policy. And just political information in general. But I think most people should be able to at least place a country within the appropriate region and point to some salient countries. So for example, if it's a country on the border between Russia and Ukraine, I would expect most people should be able to point to Russia. I mean, the entire Cold War context was a conflict against the Soviet Union, so against Russia. And Russia, in terms of landmass, is the largest country in the world. So one should hope that, and the only other really then contender for Russia is Canada. But since I would hope most Americans, this was done with American sample, I would hope most Americans could find the US and should know that Russia's not right above it. That really just leaves this country. So at minimum, we should think that people should be pointing to a country that borders Russia, that they're having a border dispute. And I would hope they could at least identify Ukraine's within Europe. So kind of along then this axis would be, at least to me, some may hold lower standards, some may hold higher standards for expectations, but at least based on kind of just processing without even knowing much information about a map, just based on kind of taking the information that's available to you at the time and making sound decisions based on processing that information. I would hope that people could come up with this type of answer, even without much political knowledge. And based on the concentration, yes, the majority of responses, the highest concentration of responses was here in kind of that area. So that's at least encouraging. But there's responses in a lot of places. I guess, again, bordering kind of Russia, this is somewhat forgivable. But then you start going down into, you know, South Asia. One would hope that most people could identify this is not Europe. There's a large kind of smattering in Africa, throughout Africa, South America. Greenland's a particularly popular choice, which is perhaps surprising given that it's a border conflict and Greenland doesn't have a land border with anyone. Iceland has a similar problem when it comes to that. Some, I'm just assuming these ones to be misclicks, given that this is the water. I'm just assuming those, I'm hoping those to be misclicks. Canada, particularly the Canadian North, quite popular for the Ukraine. So that's interesting. But the ones that really, now again, they're minorities of ones, but still common enough. would be, well, Alaska was quite a popular choice. And even the mainland US had people pointing to the mainland US. So unless Ukraine is a new state in the Republic, this is a problematic response. So in general, I mean, a lot of people did quite well, here, but there's a lot that start getting, I mean, anything along here, anything within here, and you could even make an argument kind of over around here is largely an unacceptable response, but still quite common. So why does this matter, other than being a little bit funny, given how many bad responses are? Why does this matter? So based on the questions that came after people pointed to the map, the researchers found that the less accurate our participants were, the more they wanted the US to use force, the greater the threat they saw Russia as posing to the US interests, and the more they thought that using force would advance US national security interests. The less people know about where Ukraine is located on the map, the more they want the US to intervene militarily. So the level of information people had was influencing their decision about whether the US should intervene militarily and how big of a problem they saw this conflict as being for the US. So levels of information are impacting decisions. People are making decisions based on low levels of information, and it affects the type of decision. If it was that, if they found in terms of the survey that whether somebody pointed exactly to the Ukraine or pointed in South America, pointed in Argentina, it made no impact on their foreign policy preferences, then we could say, yeah, I mean, it's a little bit funny, it's a little bit depressing maybe, but at the end of the day, it doesn't affect policy preferences. But here we see that it does actually affect whether you're able to correctly identify it, whether you understand the foreign policy situation or not, affects the decisions that you're going to make. So now that you're all depressed about public opinion and how public opinion can affect decision making, we want to get a little bit more optimistic now. And so there are models and a lot of studies on public opinion have identified what they refer to as low information rationality. And so in order to make decisions with minimal effort and information, the public use schemas, scripts, heuristics, or other types of cognitive shortcuts to make good decisions without all of the specifics. With the use of the proper heuristics, individuals can reach the same decisions that they might reach with a more informed and deliberate decision-making process. So most people don't have much information about foreign policy. They also don't have much interest in foreign policy, so they don't want to exert many resources, many cognitive resources, or many time resources to form opinions or to do research or to become informed and follow everything. So most people are relatively or uninformed and have no real incentive to change that. So they can't follow kind of rational decision-making processes to reach good foreign policy decisions because they don't have the prerequisites for that. They don't have the information and they don't have kind of the effort to be put in to reach those decisions. But they use instead kind of rules of thumb, so cognitive rules of thumbs. So in this type of situation, we do this. They use shortcuts to be able to make good decisions without all of the specifics. And in fact, many studies have found that people can, using these shortcuts, reach about the same decision most of the time that they would have reached even if they'd followed a more informed or deliberate decision-making process. So they can reach good decisions based on their attitudes, their preferences, their situation. They can usually reach pretty good foreign policy decisions even without following this rational baseline. So maybe they're low information, low effort most of the time, can still allow them to form solid preferences. And now in the previous example, we saw that there were deviations, people that having low information affect their decisions, but they may not have had all the tools available to use those shortcuts. So what are the shortcuts that people can use? So first is foreign policy attitudes. So people may hold kind of stable foreign policy attitudes that informs how they should respond in any situation of a particular type. They can also use kind of shortcuts based on external cues. So these can include cues from the media, leaders, and other foreign policy elites. So for example, if there's a news media source that you typically trust, right, and typically the opinions presented on that media program or on that media site fit with the things that you would like, then rather than becoming informed, you could just assume that if normally that media fits, their opinion fits with what you'd like. In this particular case, their opinion will fit with what you like. So you could take kind of the opinion that they formulated as a cue for how you should think. Similarly, you could look at a civic leader or political leader from your preferred political party, for example, and whatever cue that they're giving on the conflict, trust that because you agree with them on most issues, you're going to agree with them on this particular one. You take their cue and kind of trust the opinion that they're giving. So internal cues can come from personality, can come from values, it can come from ideology, or it can come from attitudes. So I want to look at a couple of these. So personality being more innate, so based on kind of the personality that you're born with, values, ideology, and attitudes all being things that are learned. So values are abstract beliefs about desirable end states or behaviors that transcend specific circumstance and context and guide evaluation and behavior, can be rank ordered in terms of relative importance. So foreign policy dispositions derive from values that structure not only political life, but social life in general. So we have certain values just in general in our life, not that aren't even necessarily related to foreign policy, but that affect our social and our political lives. So how open are we? How desiring are we of security? How benevolent? So it might be in terms of benevolence and helping others, or about security of your own community, or about openness to new experiences. We all have, so on all of these, there's multiple kind of scales of values that have been created, but on all of these type of values, some people are very strong. So some people have highly value openness. Some people highly value security. Some people highly value universalism, and other people don't value them as much. And the constellation of values that you have, so those where you score high on, will affect the your public opinion, or your foreign policy attitudes. So these values are abstract beliefs, so they're not based on concrete situations, but they're in general kind of abstract beliefs about how what is desirable in the world, or what behaviors are desirable in the world. And they transcend specific circumstance and context. So it's not about like, in this type of situation, exact situation, you should do this. But again, it's abstract belief, so about how we should be behaving in general. So in general, should you be open to new experiences? In general, how important is security? Not how important is security in this particular situation, or how important is benevolence in this situation, but how just in general important is benevolence. That guide evaluation and behavior. So based on these values, it guides our evaluation of situation and the behaviors that we choose, and can be rank ordered in terms of relative importance. So it's important to remember that we have, for kind of underpinning all of our foreign policy attitudes and all of our political attitudes in general, or our social preferences outside of politics, are based on an underlying series of values that everybody has learned throughout their life and developed throughout their life, influenced partially by personality, So there's a lot of research in psychology shows that values are partially influenced by personality, but also influenced uh, by our upbringing. So through socialization, what we learn from our family and our friends and our experiences. There's also been research on foreign policy attitudes. So these are kind of, when we're talking about attitudes, we're talking about kind of dimensions that organize foreign policy attitudes. So kind of like where you would have, you could say you've got ideology that kind of organizes a lot of political preferences. These foreign policy attitudes are kind of dimensions that organize. So so there's cooperative internationalism, militant internationalism, and isolationism. Isolationism are kind of dimensions that organize foreign policy attitudes. So a cooperative internationalist would bring together kind of a lot of specific attitudes on type of particular situations under kind of one umbrella. So we'll look at, and so some people will score high on, will have kind of strong cooperative internationalist attitudes, some will have strong militant international attitudes, and some will have strong isolationist type attitudes. So we're going to look through kind of what each of these kind of different families of attitudes or dimensions of attitudes looks at. So cooperative internationalism is an orientation towards international affairs that stresses concerns for others abroad with whom one should work towards common goals. Global solidarity constitutes a key element of cooperative internationalism, but cosmopolitanism concerns more than just self-sacrifice and service to others. Cooperative internationalists also believe that cooperation leads to mutual gains. So cooperative internationalism involves kind of a foreign policy attitude that we should be working with others towards achieving common goals. Partially, this is based out of kind of solidarity. Partially, it's based on kind of an openness to other communities. So we should be helping others through kind of a benevolence. And partially, it's based on a belief that everybody does better off if we work together. So you can achieve more gains. Everybody could be better off if people cooperate. So the total pie of gains is larger through joint effort. So if you hold this type of attitude that we should be concerned about others, we should be working towards common goals, and that working towards common goals will make everybody better off, then you're likely to support things like international organizations, which bring together people and can help create cooperation, multilateralism. So in any foreign policy goal, you should be working with others rather than working alone, and international cooperation in general. So a cooperative internationalist looking at any international issue, whether it's conflict. So if there's a conflict, should you try to solve it, initiate a war alone, or should you work with the international community to find find a solution, and if it's needed war, at least get the approval of the international community. But how should you also be working on other goals, say climate change? What type of, how should you be working to solve climate change? Should you be doing it through kind of an open cooperative framework, or should you try to be imposing your preferred solution on others? Should you go it alone, or should you be working with the international community? Militant internationalism, so is a division between hawks and doves over the importance, effectiveness, and desirability of using force to reach foreign policy objectives. So hawks are those who believe that military force is an important part of the foreign policy toolkit. So if you've got all of the different things from using military force to diplomacy to economic sanctions and economic tools. They could be used for policy. Military is an important part of that toolkit because it's an effective tool. So using military force is often effective for reaching your goals. So for example, we'll believe that using military force can protect you from others challenging you. So being strong can make the state better off. Doves, on the other hand, will typically view that using military force is less important for state security, and in large part because it's often ineffective. So it can lead to greater problems than it solves. So that's militant internationalism. And then finally, isolationism. So supports turning inwards and withdrawing from international affairs. An isolationist disapproves of both foreign military engagements and collaborative multilateral efforts to solve global problems. So this is someone who believes that the state should be kind of just focusing on its own internal problems and really kind of disengaging from other countries except when necessary. So it disapproves both of isolationists disapproves both of international cooperation, so kind of the cooperative internationalism, so solving problems together, but also disagrees with kind of the foreign military engagements that are common of militant internationalism, because often viewing that those impose costs on the domestic state, and that the foreign problems that are being solved by militant internationalism should not be the concern of the state. So yes, it may say, for example, it could be if in the US, which is powerful enough to intervene in many places, from an isolationist perspective, they might say, yes, this problem in the Middle East is, a problem for the world or for the region or for the countries involved, but it's not our problem to solve. And so we shouldn't be using our own resources to solve it. So each of these are separate but interrelated dimensions. So on each of them, you could score high or low on cooperative internationalism, on militant internationalism, or isolationism. So they're distinct dimensions of foreign policy attitudes, but they're correlated. So for example, somebody who scores high on isolationism, because isolationism involves disapproval of foreign military engagement and collaborative multilateralism, should score low on both militant internationalism and cooperative internationalism. Someone who's hawkish, who values the use of force, will typically score quite low on isolationism and likely quite low on cooperative internationalism. Now these are kind of correlations. There are strange patterns. So there's someone who could be quite isolationist, but has some limited support, say, of militant internationalism. Or there could be someone who scores quite high on militant internationalism, but also who thinks the use of military force is important, but who's also open to cooperation with others, either to form alliances for military or to cooperate on non-military issues. So there are areas where you could score high or relatively high on two of the different dimensions. But in general, scoring high on one typically means scoring lower on the others. And so through these different attitudes, you'll use these kind of families of attitudes or these broader attitudes to then form your preferences on any given issue. So if an issue arises, a specific foreign policy issue arises at any given time, so there's this looming conflict between your country and another country, how should you handle that conflict? Should you just completely disengage in isolation and saying, we don't need to be fighting with them, we shouldn't be having an issue, we should just be focused on our own thing, so let's just tell them, okay, no more fight over this, we're fine? Should you be using military force, or should you be using kind of the international community to help find a multilateral cooperative solution? Now I want to end with looking at individual differences. So far, like when I talked about there's errors in foreign policy. And when we talked about, for example, when we looked at prospect theory, we saw that kind of in general, people kind of flip their preferences and kind of based on the pattern. And if we talk about, different heuristics that people use, different shortcuts that people use. And I said that that leads often to errors or deviations from rationality. And so there's been a lot of times people found that, say, 75% of people behave in a way that deviates from what we would expect from rational choice theory in one study, or another might find 30% deviate from what we would expect in rational choice theory. And so the question that, and I was involved in this study, so the question we ask is are those who perform according to, like, who answered, so that, say in the study where 75% made the mistake, the 25% who got it right, who are right in terms of behaving in the way expected by rational choice theory, was that dumb luck? There was a multiple choice question. They, by dumb luck, selected the right one. Or was it the case that they score higher on just rationality? Is it the case that our error is random? So one time it might be one person who makes an error, and the next time it might be another person, the next time it might be another person. Or is rationality predictable? Are some people more rational than others? So there are individual differences that could explain, that could predict errors or deviations from rationality. So are there psychological micro foundations to rationality? Can we use psychology to explain who's more likely to behave in a rational manner than others? And so we used a combination of a laboratory experiment, and the laboratory experiment was a bargaining game, and it was incentivized, meaning that based on your performance, you received money. So everybody in the game received $10 for showing up, for, I think, spending about 45 minutes with us. But based on their performance, they could earn additional money. So people earned for the 45 minutes anywhere between $10 if they're absolutely terrible, they just got their show up fee. But those who performed best probably received up to about $23, I think was about the highest. So somewhere between $10 and $23 people received based on their performance. And then there was a case study on German foreign policy making in the 1920s. And so in both cases, we made predictions that there are going to be two psychological variables that explain those who are more likely to act rationally. And so we said, first, I'm going to start with the second one. So epistemic motivation is, in the face of an uncertain world, individuals with high epistemic motivation feel the need to develop a rich and accurate understanding of the world. And so you probably know people who, like, if you look at your friends and there's some new situation that emerges within your social group, some people have this, like, deep, innate kind of built-in need, psychological need to understand, to try to gather new information about a situation and understand why this is happening. And then others kind of just take the world as it is and kind of just operate it within it without necessarily having a huge need to understand new situations. They'll just kind of go with the flow and don't really need to understand it. They'll just kind of make their decisions with it and not hope for the best, but, like, not necessarily have fully understood it or considered all of the implications of the new situation and the decisions that are made with it. And so you probably have some friends who just are always trying to understand new situations, and then some who just kind of don't. And so that's the concept of epistemic motivation. So it puts the kind of the effort you're going to put in to understand a new situation. And then the second variable we had is social value orientation. And so egoism, or pursuing your own individual self-interest, is a variable. Individuals can be classified as either pro-self or pro-social. Pro-self individuals look out for themselves. Pro-social individuals seek joint gains. So pro-self ones who are always kind of trying to maximize the benefits for themselves. Pro-social individuals are ones who, yes, want to get benefits for themselves, but also want others to benefit as well. So we'll seek mutual gain. So they may sacrifice some individual gains so that there could be a fair share of the, say, of the gains, so that everybody does well, rather than just themselves doing as well as possible. It'll be, can the group do as well as possible? Now, strictly speaking, actually, social value orientation, if we talk about rationality as just self-interested, or sorry, not, if we talk about rationality just as goal-oriented behavior, then social value orientation doesn't matter, because whether you're pro-self or pro-social, that's just saying what you desire. And so you could be a pro-self with a goal of maximizing return for yourself, and you could be a pro-social individual with goals of maximizing joint gains. And strictly speaking, as long as the, kind of the decisions you make, the behaviors you take, work towards satisfying those goals, whatever those goals might be. Strictly speaking, at the most basic level of rational choice theory, either is possible for rationality. Where we came in, though, is that typically in political science or in foreign policy, when we're talking about rationality, we're talking about self-interested behavior, right? So if you look at when we talked about neorealism, when we talked about liberalism, when we talked about neoliberal institutionalism, all theories that talked about rationality, they also said rational actors pursuing their individual self-interest. So all of these models are adding in to rationality this additional variable or this additional requirement of self-interested behavior. And so this is where social value orientation comes in, that when we're talking about rational self-interested behavior. So kind of a thicker, an addition, rational choice that involves an additional assumption about the type of behavior that someone can have. And so on the baseline of explaining rational self-interested behavior, social value orientation becomes important. And so what we find are errors are not random. So errors were actually predictable. So people did better in the games or do better in life in the case study, act more in accordance with the rational choice predictions based on kind of systematic characteristics. And so rationality varies across individuals, and it's characterized by a pro-self social value orientation and combined with a high level of epistemic motivation. So the high level of epistemic motivation makes sense, right? So somebody who is trying to understand the situation is more likely, who's essentially, if you think about what the definition of epistemic motivation, it sounded a lot like kind of your definitions of rationality. Need to understand the situation, so are gathering information and analyzing the information. Those are steps that are needed in deliberation for making rational choices. So high level of epistemic motivation makes sense. But when we're talking about rational self-interested behavior, epistemic motivation is not enough. It requires also a pro-self social value orientation, so where you're going to be looking out for yourself. Conversely, pro-self social value orientation, well, yes, it will predict people who are looking out for themselves. It's not going to necessarily predict alone whether somebody makes an error or not. And what we found was that in complicated situations, like you'd normally find in international bargaining, there's often complicated it's often complicated situations where the ideal response requires nuance, requires understanding. For example, in the game that we had, changing power dynamics, and those who were pro-self, it was a game with multiple rounds. And those who were pro-self in every single round tried to pursue their own individual benefit. And what those who were at low levels of epistemic motivation didn't understand was the nuance in the game, and didn't understand that if you went for your own individual self-interest in each round, you were actually making it less likely across all of the rounds that you were going to do well. They didn't understand the context, they didn't understand the nuance of the game. It was only those who combined pro-self social value orientation with high understanding of the game, understood the context of the game, understood how the rounds were interrelated, and so were able to form a strategy across rounds that maximized their likelihood of having high gains, maximized essentially followed kind of what we would expect someone to do rationally. So based on these two characteristics, we were able to predict errors. Those who met these two characteristics were less likely to make errors than those who did not have these characteristics. So that's it for today. So I hope that you enjoy this and have a great weekend.